To have you all of us here today with us. I'm pleased to say that we're co-sponsoring today's program with the International Crisis Group, and we're trying to do a number of things. I also want to welcome our C-SPAN audience that is with us live today. And our role is to discuss something that is just now, this very moment, being announced over at the State Department, which is that on November 27th of this month, there will be a summit hosted by the United States, Condoleezza Rice and George Bush, on Israeli-Palestinian peace. And the date, I guess, has just been announced. No one officially knew it, but my colleagues to the side are well connected, and they have confirmed for me that that is, in fact, what the State Department is now releasing. But we're here to talk about the Annapolis Summit and what lies behind. And as part of this, we, three institutions, the U.S. Middle East Project, the New America Foundation, and the International Crisis Group, have been working to bring together a bipartisan group of national leaders to sort of present to President Bush and Condoleezza Rice a constructive three-part, really three-piece agenda that we think is critical for any real resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian standoff and the creation eventually of a two-state solution in this case. And the three parts of a letter that we helped orchestrate collectively are that, one, the international conference should deal with the substance of a permanent peace. Two, the conference should not be a one-time affair. And three, that the international conference should produce results relevant to the daily lives of Israelis and Palestinians. I think, just as a outside commentator to this issue, I think two of the most bold moments of this, while I think there are many important pieces of the letter which we've distributed to all of you, are that, one, that it be an inclusive process, and that means including states that are not that do not have diplomatic relations with Israel, particularly Syria, which I think my interlocutors here look as a key part of the equation in the Middle East. And then secondly, that vehicles be created to end the isolation of Hamas. And so it's a bold statement and includes many, many national leaders. I won't go through them all. I will say that I had a communication just a few moments ago that former New Jersey governor and Bush administration cabinet member Christine Todd Whitman has also joined the letter. I don't believe that she's on the one that we've just distributed, but I do want to recognize that Christy Whitman is on the letter as well, which was originally signed by seven leaders: Zbigniew Brzezinski, Lee Hamilton, Carla Hills, Nancy Kassebaum Baker, Tom Pickering, Brent Scowcroft, Ted Sorensen, and Paul Volcker. And there are a good several dozen other new names of distinguished bipartisan Americans and other foreign leaders who have signed this letter, which we've distributed to today. So this is a punctuation point to, again, raise the issue of what needs to be any part of any kind of comprehensive solution in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Now let me say a few words about my panelists and good friends here today to talk about Annapolis and beyond, and what we called and what to expect, or alternatively what not to expect. We have with us today Gaith Alamari. Gaith is a senior research associate here at the American Strategy Program of the New America Foundation. He was a policy advisor, senior policy advisor to Mahmoud Abbas, and was director of the International Policy Division of the Palestinian Authority. He's also a senior fellow of the American Task Force for Palestine here in Washington, D.C. We also have Rob Malley. Rob is director of the Middle East and North Africa program with the International Crisis Group, and of course he was senior advisor for Middle East affairs to President Bill Clinton. And we have Daniel Levy, who's director of the Middle East Policy Initiative here, the New America Foundation, senior fellow as well with the Century Foundation. He directs the Prospects for Peace Initiative. He's a fellow blogger at prospectsforpeace.com, and he's been an advisor and negotiator with many of the governments in Israel in many of the previous peace negotiations. Daniel was also the lead Israeli drafter of the Geneva Initiative, and Gaith Alamari was the lead Palestinian drafter of the well-known Geneva Initiative. So without further ado, let me open our discussion today with just a question of what my colleagues, and I'd like to start with Gaith Alamari, expect from the Annapolis Summit. What do they think the three or four most important issues that as we approach Annapolis, what does it mean, what does it not mean, what should our expectations be?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for being here. I can tell you what not to expect from Annapolis. Annapolis will not produce a breakthrough document on the permanent status issues. Unfortunately, Annapolis has been, in some ways, an exercise in mismanagement. From the very beginning, we were clear that there will be no document, no substantive document coming out. However, everyone allowed expectations to go up, to go very high. And now we're in a process of actually lowering expectations, and we're on the defensive in that sense. But this is kind of some background. What to expect from Annapolis? I think a successful Annapolis would include, I think, as Steve mentioned, three elements. The first element would be launching a credible process. And as most of you who've done work in the Middle East know, the word process in itself in the Middle East is a dirty word. We've been through that. We've done it a million times. People have lost faith in the process. So a new process has to be launched that will have to be credible. New elements have to be injected in the process that will be launched in Annapolis. And I would mention at least two elements of a new process that should be out there. The first element is, as Steve mentioned, we have to have a series of summits. Annapolis should not be a one-off. Annapolis should not be seen as the be-all and end-all of everything. We've made this mistake before in Camp David. In Camp David, when the leaders met, and Camp David was defined as the summit that will end all summits, when it failed to reach a final result, everyone was pushed to a corner and forced to assign blame. And obviously the blame was assigned to the weakest link. I think we should not repeat this mistake, and I think I see this moving in a positive way, and I do see willingness from the administration here to look at it as part of a process. The second part of that needs to be injected is the Arab role. What Arab states, Saudi, the Gulf, North Africa, their role and their participation in the process. Again, this was one of the issues of mismanagement of expectations here, where everyone at the beginning was looking at Annapolis and judging Annapolis by whether or not the Saudis will attend. This was unfortunately initiated from Israel, and this became a requirement. I don't think that we should look at the Arab role, again, as an all-or-nothing proposition. It's not as if they either attend Annapolis or Annapolis is a failure. We have to design a smarter, more productive role for the Arab states, where gradual involvement of Arab countries like Saudi will come throughout the process as the parties make progress in the negotiations. The more progress that is made, the more participation by Arab states. This will provide political cover for the Palestinians and will provide incentive for the Israelis to move forward. The third point that I would say about Annapolis, that I would look at Annapolis, is keeping the focus on the objective, the ultimate objective, reaching a permanent status agreement. As most of you know, there's been a tendency in the last couple of weeks to shift the focus from the permanent status issues to the day-to-day issues relevant to the roadmap, issues of security, settlement freeze, prisoner releases, and what have you. Now, these issues are very important for building confidence, very important for creating the political breathing space for the leaders within their own countries. However, if these become the focus, as we saw in the last really 7 years of the conflict between the two parties, if we forget about the permanent status issues and start focusing on the day-to-day issues, this will go nowhere. Issues like security do not operate in a political vacuum. They can only operate if there is a sense that progress is being made on the negotiation track. This will support these measures, and equally, if there is progress if these things move forward, then the peace process itself will be propelled forward. The focus, though, has to remain on the end game, on the peace deal, and all of the other issues, security, prisoners, settlement outposts, should be seen as tools that will support that process, as oxygen that will give the process space to breathe, not as a replacement of or as a condition for this process. I think if we see these three elements, we might be seeing the launching of a serious process that might lead us to somewhere.
Before we go to Rob Malley for his comments, Gaith, I mean, the obvious question is the Palestinian government is deeply divided. To call it a civil war of sorts is perhaps an understatement when you've got two completely different governments in two different spaces. I mean, why would you have any hope at all that anything would be achieved with such a divided government in the Palestine side?
There are two really dimensions to your question. The first one is a bit formalistic, but I still think is important. The PLO remains the address for international conduct of international policy and international affairs for the Palestinians. The PLO is a negotiating address. The PLO, headed by President Abbas, can, by all Palestinian constitutional aspects, negotiate on behalf of the Palestinians. This is formalistic, but this is important because we still have a clear address. And I do believe, actually, that the division that we're having in the Palestinian society has in some way focused attention. I think whether it's the Palestinians themselves, Abbas and his cabinet and the PLO, are very clear right now. If they do not reach a peace deal, they're losing control over Palestinian society or Palestinian national movement. There is a much more urgent incentive for them to move forward. And similarly, I think with the Israelis and the US administration, there is a realization after Hamas took over Gaza that the idea of a collapse of the PA, the idea of the collapse of the moderates, is no longer a theoretical proposition. It is real. And so I see renewed effort. Now, there's a difference between concluding an agreement, which I think the current government under Abbas can do, and between implementing implementing an agreement. And I think implementing an agreement can only happen if there is more unity on the Palestinian side. However, I believe that reaching a peace deal will put President Abbas, will put the moderates in a much better position vis-a-vis Hamas, will ensure that any further rapprochement that might happen will happen on the terms of President Abbas, on the terms of the PLO. Hamas will have to accept the conditions that were set by President Abbas, accepting previous agreements, accepting the two-state solution, and giving up violence. So there's a very important domestic dimension to reaching a peace deal. And I think this is partly what's motivating the Palestinians. And I think this is partly this has started what I see the final showdown, the final political showdown between Fatah and Hamas.
Thank you. You know, Rob, before you answer, in 1786 in Annapolis, I was interested in why Annapolis. And if you looked at what Annapolis is famous for in U.S. political history, it was the place where the Annapolis Convention was held. And it was there that Alexander Hamilton and James Madison teamed up to convince the delegates to extend their authority and to basically urge the creation the next year in Philadelphia of the Federal Convention, which led to the revamping of our Constitution, creation of our Constitution in the United States. And so it was a, you know, but you go back to Annapolis, there was a lot of bungling, there were incredibly low expectations, and I wondered if the selection of Annapolis, in part, you're our American here today, if the Annapolis is basically trying to send a signal that things are possible in Annapolis that we skeptics and critics may not suspect, that there may be something launched here that might be similar to 1786. Are you an optimist?
Well, I think you'd have to ask the State Department why they chose Annapolis. I think it was because Camp David, Shepherdstown, and Y had all been used before. But let me say a word first about the letter, which we're re-releasing today, because as you'll read it, some of the content may seem to be a bit outdated. We did this some time ago. I think the focus should not be so much on every detail. It's on the gist of the letter and who signed it. And for me, what it says, and it sends a very clear signal, that this administration or a successor administration would enjoy far more support for a more proactive, bold, inclusive policy in the Middle East than is often assumed. I mean, you should look at the names. These are people who one would not have expected a year or two ago to sign such a statement. So I think that should give some sense that there is greater room for a more proactive U.S. policy than is often believed. Now, talking about Annapolis, I think Annapolis is one of those well-known cases of a glass that is one-third full and two-thirds empty. We have had some good news. Some good news. This is the first time in 7 years that Israelis and Palestinians are discussing permanent status issues at some level. You have a Palestinian leader who is deeply committed to reaching a final status agreement. An Israeli prime minister who seems, to my view, deeply committed as well to reaching a final status agreement. And you have, for the first time in many years, an agreement that you don't have to first do certain things on the ground before you're going to talk about final status. And all those are important things that many of us in this room have been arguing for some time. That really is where the good story ends. The bad news, the two-thirds that are empty, have to do with the divisions on the Palestinian side that you just mentioned, The weakness of the Israeli government, which is not so much weakness as dysfunctionality, which with different members who have of the cabinet who seem to have their own agenda, not being able to come up with a coherent approach. And you have a U.S. administration that, even though it's given this more importance, will be distracted, justifiably, but a outcome of its own making, by crises in Iraq, in Iran, and in Pakistan. But most of all, and I think we need to focus on this, over the last several months, Israelis and Palestinians have been preparing for Annapolis, thinking, some of them, that they could get a meaningful, substantive document that would outline the parameters of a final status agreement. They've had numerous talks on it. They weren't aiming that high. It was just to give a sense of what the outcome might be. And they weren't able to do that. That should give us some pause, and it's a sobering lesson about what the parties could do on their own, what they could do, period. And I think we need to internalize that, and that's what part of the letter and also the International Crisis Group is releasing a briefing today, drawing from that lesson, the fact that they were not able even to put on paper at a time when Olmert wanted to do it, when Abbas wanted to do it, when Secretary Rice was encouraging them to do it. They weren't able to put on paper for their own political reasons because of the gaps between the two sides a document that would consolidate what everyone knows, or everyone in this room assumes we know the outcome would be. So that's why, and this brings me to what I think are the four real challenges after Annapolis, because Annapolis now has been defined down. Annapolis, I would say, is both failure-proof, because what Annapolis has become is simply a launching event for permanent status negotiations and implementation of the roadmap. It's also success-proof, because nothing really can happen at Annapolis that anyone is going to say is a breakthrough or really heralds a new era. The challenges are really going to come the day after. And bearing in mind the difficulties the parties have had to even put on paper this document about roadmap, about final status, I think there are four things we need to focus on, and many of them echo what Raith said. First is on the substance of final status. I think we know now, we should know, that the parties on their own cannot do it. For whatever reason, it's political, it's the gaps, they cannot do it on their own. They've tried and tried again. It's not clear they could do it with outside help, but we know they can't do it without. At some point, the international community, the U.S., the Quartet, Arab countries, are going to need to think about putting on the table their ideas to bridge the gaps. If they're not prepared to do it, we've seen this movie before, and we know the ending, and it's not a happy one. And that's the first lesson. The second one, what Raith was talking about, which is things happening on the ground. I think we have to learn a lesson from the past. When we frame this in terms of each side implementing confidence-building measures for the other, it collapsed. Because the parties don't really want to build confidence. They don't want to do a favor for the other. And what they do is they keep their assets for the day the final status negotiations will come to their climax. I think we have to frame this as parallel moves that both sides have to take for their own sake that will move them towards a two-state solution they say they both want. On the Palestinian side, it's security, but it's security because Palestinians want security. And if you go to any of the cities of the West Bank, you know that. They want to live a more normal life, not to help the Israelis, but to help themselves. And Israelis, and this is one of the big changes that has occurred since Camp David in the year 2000, a majority of Israelis today seem to understand that they need to disengage, to withdraw from Palestinian territories because occupation is lessening their security, not heightening it. So you need to have steps that the Israelis take for their own sake. Settlement freeze, withdrawal from certain territories, to move towards that two-state solution, again, for their own sake, not for the sake of the Palestinians. The third step comes to your point about, Steve, about Palestinian unity, and I take a slightly different take from Raith. I don't see how you can build an Israeli-Palestinian peace in such a controversial conflict on the back of a Palestinian-Palestinian conflict. It just doesn't seem to me to be possible. I think we've seen already the difficulties that the Palestinians have to put certain things on the table. I think if you have such a polarized Palestinian entity with one movement that it may be declining in its popularity, but Hamas still has too much popular support, too many weapons, and too much territorial control to be wished away. A strategy that's predicated, as it seems to be, on the notion that success in the West Bank and suffocating Gaza, putting aside the humanitarian issues that raises, but politically, the notion that by doing that, the Palestinians are going to rise up against Hamas and Hamas somehow is going to have to surrender. That's not strategic thinking, that's wishful thinking, and it's not going to produce the results that we say we want. So that's number three. I think this is not something really for the U.S., it's something for the Palestinians and for Arabs and for others to understand, and they should do it their own way, that without Palestinian unity, sooner rather than later, Even the negotiations, let alone the implementation, is going to be much more difficult. And finally, Syria, which you mentioned, and I think here there's some signs that, in fact, Israelis, Arabs, and even Americans are understanding that Syria needs to be brought in because they could do far more damage on the outside than it will on the inside. It looks like the Syrians will be coming to Annapolis. I think there needs to be a paradigm shift in our way of dealing with the Syrians, and we should stop discouraging the Israelis from negotiating with the Syrians on a withdrawal from the Golan, because that's a crucial piece of this puzzle.
Before Daniel comes in, I want you to ask you a question that involves Daniel Levy, who's worked for a number of politicians across the Israeli political spectrum, but one he worked for was Yossi Beilin. And yesterday, Yossi Beilin wrote a piece saying we should just stay home in Haaretz. And so one question is, do you agree with Yossi Beilin on this, Rob?
In the abstract, I don't know. One could go back and say, one could wonder what purpose Annapolis is really serving. As I said, it's a launching event. I don't think it's realistic today to talk about the postponing. I assume Yossi Beilin did this for political effect more than because he thinks that it's actually a realistic option. I'll let Daniel answer that.
But I didn't want to put him on the spot.
Oh, he's used to that. I think the point, though, that he's raising is, it's like reading a book with 2,000 pages and getting to the bottom line the last line and wondering what the 2,000 pages that preceded really were about. Because what's happening at Annapolis, we could have done 6 months ago, said we're going to have a conference, we're going to launch permanent status negotiations. We weren't there at the time, and sometimes it takes a lot of wasting of time to get to the point that you should have been at earlier. I think Yossi Beilin is raising a fair point. I don't think he actually believes that anyone is going to boycott this meeting.
And Daniel, when you share your thoughts on Annapolis, could you sort of help set a context, the geostrategic context, why Annapolis matters, why this letter matters, and why we often talk in silos about the U.S. U.S.-Palestinian, but Palestinian-Israeli situation almost devoid from other factors. Can you help set up the question about, we failed in the past to get a negotiated comprehensive peace, and we seem to be able to afford those failures. And I'm interested in whether the cost of failure is higher today than it has been in the past. Maybe you can address that in your comments about Annapolis.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Maybe I'll start addressing that by looking at a historical context. 30 years ago, this very day, Anwar Sadat was speaking in the Knesset in Jerusalem. 30 years ago today, he made the following comments in his speech to the Israeli Knesset. What is peace for Israel? It means that Israel lives in the region with her Arab neighbors in security and safety. Is that logical? I say yes. It means that Israel lives within its borders, secure against any aggression. Is that logical? I say yes. He then goes on to say, but there is no peace that could be built on the occupation of the land of others. Otherwise, it would not be a serious peace. I mean, that's the Arab Peace Initiative 25 years before its time. And that, in a way, is the context that we still live in, which is you have to unlock the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to achieve the stability between Israel and its Arab neighbors. I think that's on the table again. And I think the context has changed dramatically, and it's much more urgent today. What that does to the nature of regional relations in the Middle East, what that does to America's relationship with its allies in the Middle East, and in the specific context of 2007, what that does in terms of taking away a key asset from those who would seek to stir up anti-American hostility and radicalism and jihadism in the Middle East. And if you can have an inclusive peace process with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at its core, or the resolution of that conflict, but that's also comprehensive, and as Rob said, has to be inclusive, then I think you radically rebalance the dynamic in the region. Now, one of the interesting and I think encouraging things for Annapolis is, in a sense, it's the American administration beginning to reconnect the dots in the Middle East. A narrative that we didn't hear for 6 years, slowly over the last year, is beginning to be heard again, which is that Israel-Palestine doesn't exist on a different planet. Israel-Palestine and the conflict and what that does in the region, what that does to America's standing, is not some free-floating thing, to the extent to which an effort going back to try and resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is now afoot. I think that's a healthy thing. I fear, though, that Annapolis and the way Annapolis is being framed still suffers from many of the same shortcomings that the previous peace process has suffered from, and both Gaith and Rob Malley outlined what some of those were, which at its core is, can you do this without actually resolving the conflict, without knowing where Israel begins and where Israel ends, having a permanent agreed border, knowing where Palestine begins and where Palestine ends? And if indeed the retreat from giving a political horizon means that we're back to the place of confidence building, of, well, let's improve the economy, even let's improve security first. And of course there are important things that need to be done in security. But if we're still in the place which says we can slowly, gradually, incrementally, through a process of confidence building, make the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more manageable, then I think we suffer from all the same mistakes that we've made until now. This conflict, and by 2007, it should be very, very clear, does not lend itself to management. Some people would accuse the current administration of having promoted conflict escalation at certain times in its hands-off approach. There was a hope with the framing of Annapolis that we were moving towards conflict resolution. The test post-Annapolis is, are we at conflict resolution, or are we still in a conflict management place? Now, Rob has outlined what he called the one-third positive cup, and I would say that, first of all, you are reconnecting Israel-Palestine back to the rest of the region. The parties are talking again. For the last 6-7 years, if you mentioned permanent status issues, you could show your membership card in the Flat Earth Society. And we've moved beyond that point, which is a healthy thing. I see a launching of permanent status negotiations as a consequence of Annapolis. Maybe we'll get more serious efforts on the day-to-day issues that both the previous speakers addressed. You haven't seen what we used to call babysitting to prevent the kind of deterioration in the day-to-day situation. Unfortunately, it probably does require babysitting, and America would need to lead that babysitting. Now, even those things, if you manage post-Annapolis to have an ongoing negotiating process and to be trying to ameliorate in whatever way you can deterioration on the ground, it's better than where we've been for the last years. There's the Syria question, which I think may be one of the unintentional consequences. In fact, it would be dramatically ironic if the headline next week is all about Syria. And right now it's looking like it's set up to be that. If a senior Syrian attends, then this may all become about Syria rather than the Israeli-Palestinian track. and the letter says this explicitly, think it's very important to bring the Syrians back into the process. I don't think that was the intention of the administration. And I think one of the things that you do see is a particular brand of being diplomatically challenged when it comes to competence that the administration has brought to the management of this issue.
Just real quickly, why is Syria why even if the headline was Syria is that bad?
Well, because I'm saying it's not bad to have Syria back in the process, but I think the framers of Annapolis want the emphasis to be on the Israeli-Palestinian question. Now, when Annapolis is delivering so little on the Israeli-Palestinian question, and I doubt whether you'll actually get real progress between Israel and Syria, that's certainly very problematic for the Palestinian leadership that Raith has referred to. Here's the thing. In the first 4 years of this administration, each year there was a commitment to these what are now called roadmap phase 1 issues. Settlement freeze, improve security, deal with the outposts, improve the economic conditions. In 2001, you had the Mitchell Report. In 2002, you had a speech by President Bush in June. In 2003, you had the roadmap. In 2004, you had an exchange of letters with the Israeli Prime Minister. Now, that tradition lapsed in 05 and 06. Why will it be any more successful if it returns in 07? And the answer is in exactly what Raith said. Only if this is a serious move to permanent status. The optimistic scenario is that in the months following Annapolis, you do manage to fast-track Israeli-Palestinian permanent status negotiations. I don't think the Israeli domestic political traffic could bear an agreement, but it can bear a negotiation, and the Israeli Prime Minister's option then would be to go to the electorate. That didn't happen in the lead up to Annapolis. There wasn't the kind of courage shown in the lead up to Annapolis. Some people are saying that maybe the way to save Annapolis, by the way, is to have a presidential speech. If the parties can't agree on a closing declaration, then have President Bush make a statement. I would say be careful what you wish for. In 2002 and 2004, the president made what are his most substantive comments yet on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't think either of those moved us towards a resolution. In 2002, there was essentially the regime change speech. In 2004, there was the exchange of letters with Prime Minister Sharon, which undermined permanent status negotiations. It may be too harsh to say that post-Annapolis will be the challenge of putting lipstick on a pig. But at the moment, Annapolis looks more like an obstacle. Because how do you get, at the moment, both sides in a way are saying, how can we get to the other side of Annapolis without weakening our leaderships? Olmert has been weakened by the process thus far. Abu Mazen is in danger of being weakened by that process. And the kind of American engagement that we have not yet seen, and the kind of courage on the part of the respective leaderships that we have not yet seen, would be the way to move forward after Annapolis. Again, the omen isn't good. Amos Oz, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, a famous Israeli author, has written in the Israeli press today a message of hope, actually. And I think I'll leave with that message of hope, which is that we are back in a place where Israelis and Palestinians are at least ready to negotiate the tough issues that divide them. That's the only way to secure this. You still have a majority on both sides. That's not easy to sustain over time. I think we're running out of time. And Amos Oz says the Israelis and the Palestinians are ready to jump up onto the operating table, but will the surgeons have the courage to carry out the operation? And unfortunately, that still remains an open question after Annapolis.
Thank you. Before I open the floor to questions, let me ask the three of you just for quick comments on the subject that I think Senator Hagel has been working at this best, where he's been giving speeches that said there should not be a false choice here. That to some degree, some of the critics, if you read Danielle Pletka's article in the New York Times yesterday, I think it was called "Negotiating with the Devil." But whether one agrees with that or not, nonetheless, there is a very strong view that progress on Israel-Palestine means a net loss for Israeli security or Israeli interests, and that there is, in many minds, the sense that there's a zero-sum game between both Arab participants and Israeli participants. And to be quite candid, there are bad guys, perhaps on both sides, but there are bad guys outside of the process. I don't think, for instance, Iran has any interest in being supportive or cooperating with an Israeli-Palestinian process at this time. I don't think that they would perceive any real gains to be in their interest, and thus there are a lot of folks out there to save it. So there is, in the minds of it, some real zero-sum factors. But I guess my question is, coming back to this question of how do you put together an approach that can become a dominant narrative, that this is not a zero-sum game, that we should not have a false choice, but look at the issue of those players outside of the process. Some of you have mentioned it, Syria. You haven't really talked about Iran, but about the players who would want to destabilize and why they would want to destabilize this process.
Okay, I actually started reading the Pletka article and I just could not finish it. It's just too awful.
I mean, but I think it's important. I mean, I don't want to knock the
Yeah, yeah.
article in the sense that I think it
No, no,
represents
it's important
a very
in the-
strong strain
Exactly.
of thinking in the United States.
It represents a strain of thinking that, how shall I put it? I mean, there is a realization right now in Israel, and you hear this from the political echelon to the military to even the intelligence community, that says strategically the only way that Israel can really achieve peace is through, security is through peace. You can manage security issues, you can deal with what's happening right now in an operational anti-terrorism kind of approach, but this is just management of security issues, and this is unsustainable. Ultimately, strategic security for Israel, first of all, comes from a deal with the Palestinians to eliminate many of the sources of terror that they're dealing with, but strategic security as well, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis some of the other challenges, can only come through a regional security regime, a regional security cooperation regime. That includes all of the players, the Gulf states, Israel, and this can only happen if you have a peace deal. So for people here, I mean, Pletka is one, but there are others who basically are trying to push Israel to a situation where it is not viable from a security perspective, a situation where it will continues to be in conflict, continues to expend unreasonable amounts of its budget into security concerns. I think they're not doing Israel any favor. Iran. Of course, Iran is not supportive of the process. Certain elements in Iran, Ahmadinejad being the most obvious one, have really benefited from the conflict. And this is not only an Iranian issue. I mean, this is all over the region. Every time you want to whip up emotions, you wave the Palestinian flag and remind everyone that the U.S. is supporting Israel that's oppressing the Palestinians. It's a very easy, very cheap, if you wish, mobilization tool. They will not be interested in that, but more than this, there is a sort of a clash of ideas right now within the Middle East. There are two strands of thinking. One that is represented by what we sometimes call the moderate Arab regimes, which is basically diplomacy pays. The way to move forward is through diplomacy, through negotiation. There's a very strong other line supported by Iran, but by others, which basically says no. We have not, diplomacy has failed, we have gotten nothing, go for violence, go for terror. I remember after the Gaza disengagement, when Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza, Hamas had a very compelling banner that said 3 years of resistance beat 10 years of negotiation. And I think this is the kind of conflict of ideas we see in the region. And that's why I'm personally quite eager for this process to succeed, because the implication of failure, not of Annapolis as an event, but of a process, will have very wide-reaching results. Just two quick follow-up issues on points that were mentioned by my colleagues. Syria. Ultimately, Syria will have to be brought into the process. I think the Arab Peace Initiative was clear. There will only be full normalization with Israel once the whole Arab-Israeli conflict, the Syrian and Lebanese components, are resolved. However, at this moment, I don't think this is the right moment to initiate full-fledged negotiations with Syria. The Syria issue is more than simply the Golan. There is the issue of the Syrian role in Lebanon. There's the issue of the Hariri tribunal. And I think these are issues that Syria will try to bargain as it shows its willingness to move into the peace process. As a Palestinian, as a former Palestinian official, I can tell you that I don't want an Israeli-Palestinian peace process to be held hostage to Israel, to Syrian haggling and to Syrian. We've seen it before. We've seen this game before. I know this is not what my colleagues are calling for right now, but this is a caveat to keep in mind. A bit on the administration here, and I think credit is due to the admin. Without the courage and without the determination of this administration, in this last year, we would not have had Annapolis. We would not have had this process. We can criticize them for what happened before, but I think right now they're constructive, and we should support that kind of approach. But they need to be more diplomatically engaged. Diplomacy is not simply the Secretary of State making a few visits to the region. Diplomacy means a more sustained, more present role, and I think many of the negative dynamic we're seeing developing between the parties in the lead up to Annapolis, it usually comes as panic sets in when you approach a big event, you get negative. And I think if there was some American diplomatic management on the ground, we could have avoided a lot of this. And I think this is a lesson to be learned for post-Annapolis. One last point, Annapolis itself is an obstacle. I don't think so. I think having Annapolis as a date was essential for focusing the players and focusing the sides to energize themselves. Now we're getting to the event itself. You'll have to pay a political price for going to the event. That's fine. But I think the cost-benefit analysis of what was achieved until now and what price is going to be paid in Annapolis itself, I think we come out on the winning side.
Thank you. Rob Malley?
I want to come to this question of zero-sum. I think we've moved in a way from one zero-sum to another, one zero-sum paradigm to another. The first zero-sum, actually, I think we have to some extent overcome. It's a point that Daniel was making, that Raith just made. It's the administration's, I think the administration, Secretary Rice in particular, has made that connection, that in fact Israeli-Palestinian peace will strengthen Israel's security, will strengthen our security, and therefore this zero-sum that you mentioned, I think, has been largely, or is in the process of being overcome, including in Israel, where I think people like Olmert and others understand today that their security would be better promoted by peace with the Palestinians than by entrenching the occupation. But it has been replaced by another zero-sum, and maybe people always need an enemy in order to get motivated, and now it's this, the new enemy is this axis of the Shiite axis plus, so it's Iran, Syria, Hamas, Hezbollah, and they're the ones. They're the main motivator. In fact, they're the main motivator behind Annapolis. I mean, I applaud the efforts of the administration. I question the motivation, which was very much, how do we squeeze Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria? And the reason I fault that is not because I think that they're angelic and we should all get along. It's that I think that in a polarized environment, at a time of weak leadership on the Palestinian side, and this is no reflection on the personality of President Abbas, it's a reflection on the situation in Palestine post-Arafat's death, post the collapse of Fatah, and post the elections. It's a leadership that has a hard time having the legitimacy it needs to sell its agreements. At a time of such polarization, a very weak U.S. credibility in the region, which is another very important factor, collapse in credibility as a result of Iraq. In an environment that's so polarized, it's very hard to reach historic breakthroughs, because it's not as if when Iran or Hamas or Hezbollah speak, only they listen. They have resonance with others, and that is going to handcuff the ability of other Palestinians or anyone in the region, Saudis, Egyptians, Jordanians, to take the steps they need to take. So I think if we try to focalize this in a us versus them paradigm, we're simply going to complicate our task. And this is a line that Daniel has often used, but any peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians, even the most Palestinian friendly, is a Palestinian painful compromise, no matter what, which is going to generate huge opposition from vast constituencies of Palestinians in the diaspora, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. The way, if you want to maximize your chance of this of selling this and then implementing this, you don't want to do this in an environment where you're excluding groups, you're excluding nations who are going to have every interest to fuel the flames of discontent. Which brings me to my last point, which is, a debate that you were hinting at, and which we're hearing more and more in the Democratic and Republican debates, which is the whole notion of diplomacy. And what I find truly astounding is the notion, which is a bit in the article that you were mentioned, but we hear it from other places, which is, number one, that talking to others is a favor we do to them, which particularly at a time of diminishing U.S. credibility in the region is looking at things exactly backwards. And the corollary, which is we don't have enough trust in our own diplomacy that we can make pragmatic compromises without sacrificing vital principles. And that's when people talk about Syria. They say we can't talk to Syria because if we do, we're going to have to we'll compromise Lebanon's independence. That's our choice, whether we choose to compromise Lebanon's independence when we talk to Syria about a whole host of issues. And likewise with Iran. I think we could be very clear-eyed about what our interests are, and nonetheless engage in discussions and in negotiations with parties who may not hold exactly the same views that we do. And again, at a time where the region is facing perhaps greater dangers than certainly any time in my lifetime, with Iraq, Iran, sectarian polarization, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, I mean, wherever you look, trouble is beckoning. At that time, to put one hand behind our back and say there's some things we can't do, there's some people we can't talk to, I think is really shortchanging the American people, but also shortchanging the region. And that's why I think we need to move from a zero-sum approach to one of pragmatic diplomacy.
Thank you. Daniel.
First of all, there are those for whom this is a zero-sum game. If you're a maximalist on either side, whether you're sitting at the AEI in America and you're Daniel Pletka, or you're sitting in a settlement on the West Bank and you're from the Council of Settlers of Judea and Samaria, or whether you're on the Palestinian side being a maximalist. Where I see the Israeli center of gravity at the moment, though, is not there. I see the Israeli center of gravity in a place that is groping towards how do we do the deoccupation that we now understand is vital for Israel's national security interests. For me, Olmert represents that. And by the way, I don't think Olmert, to the extent to which Annapolis will not be a stunning success, is the spoiler. I think Olmert did not receive the encouragement he should have received from Washington enough, and I think, unfortunately, very unfortunately, Olmert did not receive the encouragement from the domestic political actor which should have allowed Olmert to drive this from the middle, namely the Israeli Labour Party and its leader Ehud Barak, who I think has a huge share in the fact that Annapolis will not be the success it could have been. But I think what Olmert represents is this Israeli recognition, perhaps belated, perhaps still too hesitant, but nonetheless very significant, that the drain on Israel, the drain on our economy, the drain on our military of maintaining this occupation in the territories is terribly, terribly self-defeating. Look at the report, which is really going to be unpleasant for Prime Minister Olmert, of the war last summer in the Lebanon. One of the major findings there is going to be about Israel's Israeli military preparedness for that kind of a conflict as a consequence of the essentially policing duties that the IDF is involved in, day out, in the Palestinian territories. There are very pressing domestic issues which are constantly pushed under the rug because we've not resolved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Not to mention the occasional very revealing article about a brain drain, or about, now that the EU has expanded to 27 and Poland and Romania and Czechia, the Czech Republic are in the EU, of Israelis taking out a second passport. Israelis of Romanian or Polish extraction taking out a second passport just in case. And for anyone familiar with the Zionist narrative, they'll know how antithetical to Zionism that is. So I think what you see is an Israeli side groping towards dealing with these issues. I think it's good that we're having the debate again, by the way. I think it's positive that you have an Israeli prime minister again explaining to an Israeli public why two states is an Israeli interest, why there will have to be withdrawals, why the parts of Arab-Palestinian Jerusalem that were unilaterally annexed are not going to be Israel in the future. Two things, though, that I think is really holding us back, that we're not coming to terms with. One is this notion that you can first of all, this sequentialism, that you can first of all deliver full security under conditions of occupation, and that will then allow you to do deoccupation. It don't work that way. And the second is this inability, and we've talked about it already, to in any way come to terms with the fact that there is a strong Islamist current on the Palestinian side that will neither be strong-armed nor willed out of existence, and that we're going to have to come to terms with them. I would like just to say, though, also on the American side, I think it's positive that Secretary Rice is again explaining why a two-state solution is important. I think it's positive that she went, for instance, to the conference of the United Jewish Communities in Nashville, Tennessee, last week, and explained that. I think it's very encouraging, first of all, the letter that we're re-releasing today, but I think it's also very encouraging that there's been an initiative in Congress led by Congressmen Ackerman and Bustani, spearheaded by a very interesting alliance of progressive Jewish pro-Israel groups, Israel Policy Forum, Americans for Peace Now, Brit Tzedek V'Shalom, and by Arab American groups, the Arab American Institute, I believe the American Task Force on Palestine was supportive of the letter too, and by Churches for Mideast Peace. That gathered a number of important signatures. It was encouraging Annapolis. It wasn't trying to create an obstacle course. It was encouraging the administration to go forward. AIPAC decided to take a constructive position on the letter. What was fascinating was that inside AIPAC, you had people like Sheldon Adelson, who is behind this Freedoms Watch group, saying, hey, why the hell isn't AIPAC opposing Annapolis? It's a healthy debate to be having here in America. So if you want an unintended, I imagine, byproduct and positive consequence, it's that debate is happening because, unfortunately, just as back home in the region, there are people here who will tell you that being pro-Israel is that we can never cede an inch and that Israel can never make peace or talk to its neighbors or any of these things. They're wrong. They're not doing America any favors, and they're certainly not doing the Israelis any favors. Airing those things occasionally is positive.
Thank you. I've got two signers, and perhaps more. I tend to have virtual and email relationships with many people, but I wanted to recognize former Congressman Steve Solars, who's here, and also Ambassador Harriet Babbitt, who both signed the letter. There may be others of you out there. I apologize that I may not recognize faces, but I wanted to give either an opportunity to make a comment or pose a question first and then open it up to the floor. Congressman Solars, are you? Ambassador Babbitt?
Thanks very much. I am in the midst of a great deal of pessimism, very much encouraged by this discussion, and particularly by Daniel's last comment. I think the Annapolis has really served to kind of break the dam of discussion in this country about what needs to happen in the region. I'm always impressed with my position in the region by how much more rigorous the discussion is there than here. So I just want to understand it.
Thank you. Steve Solars, would you like to make a comment as a signer of the letter?
Well, I remember a sermon a rabbinic friend of mine once gave, in which he said that even the Messiah needs a strategy. And, as I consider the prospects for the success of this effort, which I applaud, I have to confess that I don't see a strategy on the part of the Palestinians, the Israelis, or the administration in terms of how to deal with Hamas that can possibly produce a successful outcome. Some time ago, the Hamas leadership, as I understand it, indicated that they were prepared to have Abbas negotiate with the Israelis on behalf of the Palestinians. And in the event an agreement was reached, which they doubted, they would be prepared to have it submitted to a referendum among the Palestinian people to accept the results. But I see just this past week, the Hamas leadership withdrew that mandate. So it now has put itself in a position where it doesn't support the negotiations. And since in the event an agreement is reached, it will clearly fall short of maximalist demands, Hamas is virtually certain to oppose it. Indeed, they're likely to try to obstruct the negotiating process by launching terrorist attacks. And we see from past history that it's impossible to conduct meaningful negotiations while terrorist attacks are taking place. So, given the extent to which the Palestinian leadership, the Israelis, and the Americans all seem opposed to bringing Hamas back into a unified Palestinian leadership, I guess the question I have is, how can this possibly succeed unless the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Americans can be persuaded to try a different approach for bringing Hamas in? And how can we succeed in getting those three parties to change their approach? Because without such a change, I think this whole exercise, the prospects for the success of which are dim to begin with, would be virtually non-existent.
Thanks. Gabe, can you respond?
Sure. Just a bit of background. I actually do believe that one of the biggest mistakes that happened after the Hamas election back a couple of years ago was that Hamas was not given a chance to govern. I mean, that would have been the best way to bring them into the mainstream. Not doing them a favor is actually they would be walking into the inevitable trap of being in power, where you have to deal with real issues, you have to deal with real compromises. And I think that would have been mainstreamed, and I think that the more moderate leadership that they have would have prevailed. Unfortunately, post-June, after the Hamas violent takeover of Gaza, two things happened. One thing is that the moderate leadership of Hamas, or the less extremist leadership of Hamas, has become very much marginalized. And what you pointed out, the more recent statements that they made, is an indication of this. I mean, when you have an armed takeover of a territory, obviously your more militant, your more extreme lines are going to be in charge. And what we're seeing now within Hamas itself is a dynamic of a power struggle. Not a split, we're nowhere near a split, but there is a power struggle between three elements: the military leadership and the really hardline ideologues in Gaza, the political leadership in Gaza, and the political leadership in the diaspora. And I think until that power struggle is not concluded, but at least is in a clearer place, it's going to be very hard to talk to Hamas. The other dynamic that was created after June is the fact that it's now become politically impossible for Abbas to talk to Hamas again. What was a power struggle to begin with between the two sides has now really become an existential struggle, and whoever blinks first is gonna lose. I agree with you that, though, that there is no strategy right now for dealing with Hamas. What's clear that you cannot have a military way of dealing with Hamas in Gaza. They're in charge. There will not be an invasion to take it over again. The notion that some entertain that the public is just going to rise up and rebel against Hamas is also very unrealistic. Ultimately, the relation with Hamas will have to be negotiated. The question is on whose terms. If there are negotiations today with Hamas, between the PA and Hamas, this is recognition that Hamas, if the negotiation is from the baseline of Hamas being in charge of Gaza, this is a realization that Hamas has won. This is really conceding to Hamas's ground, and there will be very little ability to bring Hamas to accept the bare minimum, which I think is the two-state solution. And again, this is part of the strategy, is how do you strengthen the negotiating position of someone like Abu Mazen to be able to strike a deal with Hamas on his terms, on terms that are acceptable to the international community. My fear is that if there is progress in the diplomatic track, if Abu Mazen becomes in a better position to negotiate this, external elements, the US, some European countries, Israel, might push him away from this kind of a deal with Hamas, as we saw in the past. So we have to be more pragmatic once the conditions are right, but I don't think the conditions are right yet.
I want to. We can take responses if they're brief, because we've got lots of questions. So brevity is encouraged, but
very brief. Steve mentioned the sermon. I'll just mention an expression. I don't have his background. When you're in a hole, stop digging. And the problem I see with what Raif just said, and I understand the logic, but it hasn't worked up until now. We're always looking for the right moment when Hamas is weak enough, when they're under enough pressure to finally talk to them. This is the same thing I was saying earlier about the U.S., and it's sad to see the Palestinians sort of, the one thing they're taking from this administration is not the best, which is this notion that if you talk to them, you're going to strengthen them. Yes, there are divisions within Hamas, but what outsiders do can have an impact into who, on what side of what division can prevail.
If I may.
Sure.
What Rob said before is important. Motivation matters. What is behind this Annapolis and the process? If this is about how do we move to a serious resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then that determines one attitude towards Hamas, which is about bringing them inside the tent and, as you said, Congressman Solars, again having them in a position that they will acquiesce, they will accept Abbas leading the process. If this is about, again, proving it's good against evil and it's a pedagogical exercise, then you're not going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because you're giving all the incentive to Hamas to be a spoiler. And being a spoiler is not just military. Being a spoiler is also undermining the legitimacy and the credibility of any process that would be led. In fact, one of the biggest threats to post-Annapolis is an escalation, a deterioration in the situation in Gaza. One can very well envisage Israel eventually, because of a bad Qassam rocket attack or something else, being in a position where there is a more deep and aggressive incursion into Gaza. That would trigger a situation, a scenario there of significant, I imagine, Palestinian, including civilian losses. There'd be Israeli military losses too. Under those conditions, I think it's very difficult to imagine that Abbas will be able to be in a room with Olmert, and you would have the unraveling of Annapolis. I think there is a strategy. I think Abbas can be pursuing one line regarding Hamas, while the international community pursues another. Some of the international community, at least. I think that those actors who are willing and ready to get in a room with Hamas should be encouraged to do so, not the opposite. One should pursue a ceasefire between Gaza and Israel with the Hamas, and then you begin to create the conditions, I think, where you can begin to put that Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Let me open the floor. Nick?
Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. Mr. Malley, you said that the Israelis and and the Palestinians are unable by themselves to come to an agreement. A third party is needed. I agree with you. Because the land issue, which is the fundamental issue, control over land, is intractable. It is not, it's the essence of a state. But here we have a third party with no leverage over Israel, the United States. And because the United States has no leverage over Israel, it has no leverage over the Palestinians. How can you expect a third party to play any role in this very difficult issue of land?
Thank you. Rob?
I'm not sure I accept the notion that the U.S. has no leverage. I think the U.S. has leverage with both parties. In fact, with all parties in the region, it's a matter of whether they choose to use it and whether they choose to use it well. I'm not talking about imposing a solution. I'm not talking about forcing anything. But I think there's a lot that the U.S. can do from what it says and what it does to encourage, to prod, to pressure the parties to do what it thinks is in their interest and in U.S. vital national interest. So I think this is a matter of political choices that the administration has to make. And as I said earlier, I think the letter and the other letter that Daniel mentioned shows that in this country there is greater untapped willingness to see the U.S. play that kind of role than is usually assumed. And again, this is not a matter of being tough on Israel and Israel bashing. It's prodding, pressuring all sides to do what, in fact, deep down, and as Daniel said, I think Prime Minister Olmert wanted to go much further here. He wanted to go much further. So it's a matter of the U.S. playing Israeli politics in a smarter way than they've done it, because you can't leave Olmert on his own. You need to put pressure on others so that he will have the ability to do what I think, deep down, I think there's every evidence he's wanted to do.
I'm sorry. Yes, right here.
Thank you. Chicken Dello for the Washington Times columnist. You talk about that all the party that the United States has leverage on all the parties, but also its credibility is diminishing in the region. Now, my question is, do you see? I mean, a lot, different players in the region has different reading to what the U.S. status is in the region. Now, do you see that they are cooperating? The Arab countries are cooperating with the U.S. in Iraq, although it's independent from the Israeli and Palestinian threat. But if you go to the region, I mean, the perceptions are all linked to one another. It's almost impossible to, make a separation between the issues. Do you see them, that they are helping the U.S. or they have a more, different thought of, having a covert or overt, desire of a full-fledged war against the U.S. to really, bring it down?
Responses?
Happy to. Can I start?
Okay, let me also piggyback on Tianu's excellent question. I also think the United States has influence on all players, and I'm wondering if that's the best approach, because to some degree it divides our government. And if you look at the United States approach, and certainly Condi Rice is out front on this, but there are other players in the administration who are strong, who have very great weight in policy, who lurk just beneath the surface and don't support this direction. And the question is whether or not there ought to be stakeholders outside the Palestinian-Israeli relationship that have similar weights but don't have the similar interests. In other words, if we were competing, in the Soviet era, it was easier to get deals in third parties because we would negotiate amongst ourselves and try to influence the two parties there. But if we're complicit in the arrangements of both sides, doesn't that divide us, and doesn't it preempt, to some degree, reaching conclusions?
Very quick answer then. I think the Arab world has been in this paradoxical situation for some time, but it's been accentuated over the last several years as a result of the Iraq War, where you have relatively weak regimes, they have their own legitimacy deficits in their own countries, which produces two paradoxical outcomes. On the one hand, they're more dependent on the U.S. as their main ally, but they're also far more leery of being associated with it and much more keen to denounce it because they know where popular sentiment is. So I think, and that plays out in all arenas, in Iraq, in Palestine. They want the U.S., but at the same time they feel compelled to denounce it because of the absolute lack of credibility that the U.S. has in the region. So you see this on the Palestinian track, where on the one hand they push the U.S., they say they want to be active, But then when push comes to shove, when the moment comes, they wonder whether, in fact, given the toxic environment, the polarization, their own public opinions, if they get involved in this uncertain process, they're not going to lose more than they're going to gain.
I would just echo the same thing. For someone like King Abdullah of Jordan or of Saudi, they know they need the U.S. You know, the U.S. is the only party that can deliver what you need diplomatically, security, financially, what have you. On the other hand, it's very embarrassing right now if you're an Arab leader and you're close to the U.S. And every time you do any cooperation with the U.S., you have to go back home and justify yourself and deal with a hostile domestic environment. And in some ways, I mean, this is the connection, this is part of the connection that we've been always talking about. If the U.S. is more proactive in resolving Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it becomes easier for other countries to cooperate with the U.S. more, other regimes to cooperate with the U.S. In other arenas, be it Iraq, be it Iran, what have you.
I think Secretary Rice made a series of visits to the region in the second half of during this year. She met with what was called the GCC +2, the Gulf foreign ministers, Egypt and Jordan. She met with what's called the Arab Quartet. She heard the following message. Her agenda, Iraq, 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 and some Iran, Iran. Arab foreign ministers, give us something on Israel, Palestine, give us something on Israel, Palestine. And I think that was part of the birth of Annapolis. Unfortunately, we're still going to have that conversation again because Annapolis hasn't been the courageous step forward that people hoped it would be. This was the Iraq Study Group report. I mean, the Iraq Study Group report talked about the outside in, and they drew that connection between being able to make asks of Iraq's neighbors in order for them to be a stabilizing influence as you try and build a central government and some kind of national reconciliation, but that requires much broader American diplomatic engagement in the region, and in particular a diplomatic surge when it comes to the Israeli-Arab issue, because they said it broadly. They talked about Syria as well. This is the very beginnings of that, but it's still on tranquilizers rather than on steroids.
Great. You're very back here.
David Smith from the United Nations. I'm struck by the way that you're all looking beyond Annapolis. I think Daniel referred to the day after is what really matters. And leaving aside, it's not my place to get into the politics of Gaza right now, but Steve Solar's raised it immediately. My question is, what is the message the day after for the people of Gaza? A place where the UN at the moment is increasingly having to deal with 1.5 million Palestinians, arguably the largest Palestinian population on earth. Where only a couple of weeks ago, the head of our aid agency was in this town saying we can provide about 60% of the ration that's needed for the folks in Gaza. What is the message, in your view, coming out the day after from Annapolis to those people?
Interesting. Daniel?
I mean, here, I think, unfortunately, you won't hear that mentioned. Not by the American leadership, not by the Israeli leadership, but perhaps most troubling and damning, not by the Arab leadership. When the Arab foreign ministers meet in Egypt, I believe it is on Thursday.
Right.
Friday now? You will hear all kinds of demands being raised pre-Annapolis. I'll be very surprised if one of them is lift the siege on Gaza. Everyone has bought into this narrative. Punish the leadership there by punishing the civilians. I think it's totally counterproductive, not to mention immoral. And anyone who thinks that the Gazans will somehow be very positive towards the West and towards Israel because we're helping to rid them of their nasty leadership by starving them really needs their heads tested. This will have, A, it's immoral, but B, it will have the exact opposite effect to what we're testing.
Steve, if I may, just a quick point.
Quickly, yeah.
Just quickly, there will be no direct messaging, nor should there be a direct message to Gaza at this stage, in my opinion. Ultimately, it's a long-term message of negotiation versus violence. However, I think, one thing that disturbs me in some of these discussions is we tend to forget that Hamas is responsible for what's happening in Gaza at some level. It's not like it's a surprise once they took over Gaza that there will be a boycott. And the focus always that the international community are the bad guys who are starving the Gazans. And getting Hamas off the hook is also quite problematic.
the back, Eli Lake. They can just hold it there, so.
Hi,
You don't have to be near it, Eli, just.
okay. This is a question for Rob Malley mainly, but it's about your argument about Hamas and bringing in Syria. How do you avoid giving the impression to others watching who might have terrorist inclinations that campaigns of political murder, terrorism, and violence will eventually be useful means for accomplishing the goals of statecraft, which at least was a key principle during the Oslo process that all parties seem to project?
So, yeah, how do you avoid creating the impression that you're rewarding bad guys in this process?
I tried to answer that earlier. Throughout the Oslo process, we dealt with Syria. I'm not sure that Syria was behaving exactly.
You dealt with Syria before their campaign of political murder.
Oh, I think we had plenty to say about Syrian behavior throughout the world at that time. I mean, just look back at what the State Department was saying about Syria at the time. It goes back to this issue of whether we think that negotiating with foreign entities is a way of providing them with legitimacy, which I don't really understand. I don't know that Syria needs our legitimacy, particularly U.S. legitimacy at this point. As Reith said, our embrace may be more embarrassing than helpful. But it also has to do with whether we can stick to our principles and negotiate toughly, even as we talk. I mean, I don't want to make analogies to the Cold War, but they do spring to mind. There are many entities that one has dealt with, that the U.S. has dealt with in the past, despite their own behaviors. And, I think we're going to have to understand that, swallow that. The mistake has been, and it's always the same mistake, as I say, of digging a hole when you're in it, that we set these conditions. We won't talk to Iran under these conditions. We won't talk to Hamas under these conditions. We won't talk to Syria under these conditions. But so once you set those conditions, then of course it looks like you're surrendering to their terrorist to their blackmail by talking to them. The mistake was setting the conditions in the first place. But since it's not helping you, I don't see any evidence that the behavior of any of the actors who are boycotting, whether it's Iran, Syria, or Hamas, has improved as a result of the boycott. In fact, we continue to attack them, we continue to criticize them. So we got to set back. Now, maybe we have to think of artful ways of doing it without losing face. I'm all in favor of that. But let's not keep going down the path when we know it leads to an impasse, and we've bumped our heads on that wall several times before.
I just want to follow up.
Yeah.
After the coup in Gaza, how would that not encourage other Islamic supremacists from thinking, I could have a coup, and then America and Israel and everyone will talk to
It depends.
and get political
I didn't say America would talk to Hamas. I think that's beyond the
That's
realm
not
of
in the letter.
possibility. I'm saying, what's the content of the conversation with Hamas? You can talk to Hamas. I mean, the Norwegians do, the Swiss do, others, the Arabs can. I think there should be more of it, not, as Daniel said, not discouraged but encouraged. But the message could be clear. You want certain things. There's certain steps you're going to have to take, first of all in Gaza, but also on the political front. And it's not a light that you switch on or off, where either you embrace them or you don't talk to them. There are things you do in engagement and in diplomacy and in statecraft, to use your term, which entail negotiating the terms under which they actually could get what they want. And I think, but for me the main point is, it's a policy that's failed and failed again, and if we don't learn the lessons from that, we're going to be having the same discussion a year from now.
There's one quick editorial, because I think Eli Lake raises a very important point, that though I believe that we need to start with the situation as it is today and not how we'd like to wave a wand and pretend it would be, there's another dimension to this, which is really the reverse of somewhat of Eli's said, because there was a point, particularly before the elections, when Israel and the United States might have, with Mahmoud Abbas, moved much more expeditiously to reward the moderates. I mean, one of the things we're dealing with is that we go to the brink with moderates, and what anybody ends up winning in that case is very thin margins, very thin political margins. And you do create a situation, to be quite realistic, that if you do border incursions from Syria, or you take this case, you can engender, you can win lots of prisoners, and you can go back as heroes by pursuing and essentially being rewarded by the circumstance. That needs to be undone. And I'll remember very well, I don't want to compromise any of my colleagues here, but I remember a bit ago, a year and some ago in New York at the UN General Assembly speech, when President Bush gave, I think, a fairly dramatic tour de force talk about the Middle East. And I read it and I said, wow, this is a very impressive talk. The Palestinians must be thrilled. Well, I heard from some of my friends the Palestinians were not thrilled, because they had just put together, after having been ignored by the United States and Israel, finally put together the unity government with Hamas. Remember, where did Hamas not where did Hamas come from, but we encouraged Palestine to include Hamas in its elections, and we encouraged them over Abbas's objections to proceed with the election. And thus, we told Abbas, after he put together the government, you can't deal with us unless you break that government up. So I think, Eli, you raise a very important point, but it also gets back to the point that we've not done much to reward the moderates in the process earlier on. But let me open up. Yes, sir, right here.
Thank you. Howard Self with the Universal Peace Federation. My question is about the role, how you see the role of faith leaders in the process. Many people think the problem with Islam could easily be solved, or possibly if moderates would speak up, take a stronger role. Actually, we see that moderates are needed in all three of the major faiths that are involved in the process. I know the Holy Lands Council was formed recently, but some are thinking that a regional grouping, a larger grouping, is necessary. I'd like your response on that.
Any response on faith leader participation?
I think faith leaders and faith could play a very important supportive role for a process, with two caveats. Making sure that it does not serve into redefining the conflict into a religious or faith-based one, and keeping it political, and making sure as well that when we're negotiating an actual deal, that we only deal with issues of hard politics and hard reality, and not go into trying to negotiate faith, because that will get us nowhere. So it can create a supportive environment, but one has to be careful how one approaches it.
Any other comments? And also a comment because it's something that interests me. I don't know a lot about, but there's also a lot of fragmentation in faith-based communities. When you look at that, I know while he's not a minister, Bob Novak's been participating in various Catholic missions and commenting and written some very, I think, progressive commentary on the region. But then you compare that to Pat Robertson's views, it's a bit different. Richard Land, someone I respect a great deal, has had some different takes. So there's quite a bit of diversity in this, but it's important. Other questions? Yes, sir, right here.
Yes, Dan Lieberman, just...
Let's we'll wait for the microphone to come up. Yes.
Just some information and then two simple questions. I just returned, actually, from the Middle East as part of a delegation promoted by the Council of National Interest. And we talked to all the the principal Palestinian Authority leaders, and also in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. We were unable to talk with the Israeli leaders, although we did talk to two people in the Knesset. I think that shows something right there. And actually, at the beginning, the Palestinians were very optimistic, especially Foreign Minister Omar Faki. I think he tried to show us optimism. Salim Fayyad, the Prime Minister, said they were guided more by fear of failure rather than promise of success. But as we went on...
But you saw that as optimistic?
Well, I said less optimistic. But as we went on, I noticed Israel kept raising the bar, and the promise of success seemed to be diminishing until we got to Lebanon. And there, a lot of people said that the whole process, Israel process, related to Annapolis is actually guided by Avigdor Lieberman, my namesake, black sheep of the family, of course. And then we learned that Israel had actually requested that not only did they want recognition of a Israel state, but they want recognition as a Jewish state. So my two questions are, doesn't that recognition of a Jewish state completely apply a barrier to any solution to this Middle East process? And does Avigdor Lieberman play a really significant role in guiding Israel's participation in Annapolis?
A very brief response.
We all have our Liebermans. I don't think Lieberman plays a defining role in Annapolis. I think his role has been elevated for the reason I mentioned earlier, which is that Ehud Barak has decided to position himself on the right of Ehud Olmert. Let me just drive home this point. The opportunity presented by the establishment of Kadima was that former people from Likud on the center-right would move to a position of working towards a solution to the conflict, and that they could lead this from the center. And anything that an Olmert Kadima government did would be by definition being led from the center, because there would be serious political actors to the right of it, including Lieberman, and serious political actors to the left of it, including the Labour Party. So you'd always have a push from the right and a push from the left. By positioning himself to the right of Olmert, Barak broke that balance, broke that equation, and undermined the very value of having a center-led, Kadima-led process. The particular question of recognition of the of Israel as a Jewish state, there's language that one can come up with that you could have as part of a permanent status package. But to raise that as the one issue now, I think, is something of a red herring. It almost begs the response from the Palestinians that if you want us to recognize you as being Jewish, then I thought that included a circumcision, so cut off the West Bank. But it's not something that was raised with Jordan or with Egypt. We have peace treaties with both which don't recognize Israel as a Jewish state.
Yes, sir.
Ron Campius from JTA. What if this, what you talk about, all three of you talked about the need for greater diplomacy from the Bush administration and greater diplomatic involvement. What if this administration is constitutionally unable to do that? And because what the lead up to Annapolis reminds me of, the movie it reminds me of, is not Camp David, it's actually the preamble to the Iraq War, when reporters, or not just reporters, everybody would ask the Bush administration, how are you going to deal with Sunni versus Shiite? Democracy will take care of that. There's this gap between the goal and how you get to the goal, and there seems to be a constitutional inability to deal with how you get to the goal, and that seems to be what's happening in the lead up to Annapolis. And does buying into Annapolis, without, let's say, waiting for the next administration, whoever may lead it, to come along, does buying into Annapolis create a danger of the kind of collapse that we've seen in post-Iraq?
Thanks.
I mean, I don't think anyone is constitutionally unable to do with anything. I think they're learning. I think they're learning a lot, and I think what we saw in the last year definitely shows that they've made a long way from where they were 5-6 years ago. So I wouldn't be that pessimistic. And you have a good for State Department, etc., etc. You have the brains now. It's a question of getting them together. But the question that you really asked is the other one is: should we wait for another administration? No, we can't. I'm talking here as a Palestinian. We cannot. It's not like you're going to have a next administration and the first order of business is going to be, oh yeah, let's do the Palestine-Israel thing. It's going to take some time to get re-energized. Things cannot wait that long on the ground. Between settlement expansion, between fragmentation of Palestinian political system, if we don't start moving right now, at least laying the ground, I think things might be too late. We are not in a stable position there.
Rob?
I agree with what Raif said, with this caveat, which is a bit impolitic to say. If Annapolis actually just leads to nothing, in other words, at the day after Annapolis, you don't see any real progress on final status, nothing changes on the ground, and things remain static, then one could say that Annapolis will have been a disservice, because it would have allowed people to remain in the status quo, even though the status quo is leading nowhere, because it creates this illusion of a process. I mean, I don't take from that better know Annapolis than Annapolis. I take from that it is absolutely critical that after Annapolis, things change. Because, I mean, part of the discussion we've had today about the attitude towards Hamas, the attitude towards the Palestinians, towards final status, if people are content with simply a nice conference, and then nothing changes, then it removes the pressure and the incentive to change a status quo that's not working, because you gain yourself 6 months of doing nothing, and then leaving to the next administration an even worse situation than we have today. So I take your point. I think trying to be an optimist in these times, I think it's important to take from that the urgency to do something rather than the necessity to do nothing.
Let me press on one point. In Danielle Pletka's piece, she made a point that I think is true, that this administration, like many presidential administrations, leaves until the very end of its tenure this issue. And Gates just said we can't expect the next administration, be it either Republican or Democrat, to have the momentum to go into this. But I think foreign policy is different today. Foreign policy and the condition of America's national security portfolio is pretty eroded, and thus to go out and try to approach some of these big issues could create, I think, a reinforcing positive spiral in global events as opposed to a negative one. And I'm wondering whether the conditions of the next administration are so fundamentally different that you're wrong, that this can't actually be left to the tail end of an administration's priorities.
were you asking?
Yeah, either one. I mean, I'm challenging you because I think it's fundamental because, because then, if you look at this, in my own view, I look at the best outcome you can get from Annapolis is a sort of a railroad track summit that lays railroad track that can be picked up by the next administration. But if you're going to send off the workers and forget where the Lael was raid, why do that if you're not going to do it? So I think it's very important to challenge the assumption that the next administration won't deal with this on the front end of its term.
And the very important point you're making, I think, and which I think Raith made earlier, is how this administration passes off this peace process to the next one is going to be critical. If it's passed off in a place where it looks like we've hit a dead end and you got to start from scratch, then I do believe that the next administration, whoever it is dealing with Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, is going to say, why should I start on this one, which is going to take me forever to do? Now, if things are closer to fruition, then perhaps your hypothesis is right in that an administration could say this is part of a global Middle East effort we have to make simultaneously. Syria, Iran, Iraq, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at its heart. It's high hope. I mean, we've had now several administrations that have waited till the end, and I was part of one. So I think it is part of our DNA. But maybe it could change if it's if it's passed on in a better shape, and if in fact the next administration understands the connecting dots that Daniel mentioned.
Just in one respect, you could argue that they're slightly ahead of the curve. This is November of 2007, 14 months out from the end of the administration, not July 2000 Camp David, just 6 months out from the end of an administration. They're raising permanent status now. They could have more months to run at it. I agree, that's very optimistic. There's a big difference, Ron, as well, of course, between 2007 and 1991, when Madrid, which is a perception of American power in the region after the successful repelling of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So it's a very different American and regional power dynamic. The one thing that hasn't been mentioned that really worries me about Annapolis is an international conference, even if they call it a meeting, it's an international conference, is a tool that you can't deploy every 2 months. And if you deploy that tool as an administration and it gets you nowhere because it's been ill-conceived and ill-prepared, then Rob's right. Then it has a cautioning effect on future administrations. Everyone thinks, oh God, they tried it. This is something that is not worth investing in. I think for me that could be one of the real negatives of Annapolis doing nothing.
We have here, I'm going to take one 30-second question.
All right,
and yeah.
Gene Bird from CNI. I'm fascinated by the fact that the organizations such as yours and ours and others are playing a role in all of this, and I would like to ask the panel what kind of a role do you think they should play in the post-Annapolis era, and I wonder if Stephen Solars would.
I wish we had time, but we don't. So we've got to be off the air in 2 minutes with our C-SPAN audience, so I'm going to ask for quick responses from Gaith, Rob, and Daniel, but we've got about 30 seconds each.
Just be positive. That's the one thing that I would urge for. I mean, one thing that I found disturbing about Annapolis is that everyone goes back to default of, okay, it's not going to work, let's blame the administration, let's blame this, let's be pessimistic. And this engenders a certain atmosphere. And I think we have a serious effort going on, and we all should just create positive energy around it.
Thank you. Rob?
I think we have to always push the limits of conventional thinking. I think that's always true. We don't have many assets. We don't have troops, we don't have money, we don't have diplomats. We have ideas and we have freedom because we could say whatever we please, and I think at least the international crisis groups sees it as trying to put forward realistic proposals, but always pushing the boundaries of what is people's comfort zones, and hopefully we've had some effect. Certainly we'll continue to try.
Daniel?
I think there's a reality on the ground in the Middle East that one has to adjust to, and we've made the comments that we've made in the letter that was re-released today. The three of us authored a piece in the American Prospect on 10 Commandments where we tried to address the kind of thinking that I think Rob just mentioned. Then there's the reality of the debate in the US, and I think in that respect one uses the opening that Annapolis creates, and one pushes an agenda for the next year, whether it's as part of convincing this administration or as part of creating an assumption that the next administration doesn't wait till year 7 to do this.
Thank you. I would take us back. I'm tend not to flourish in optimism. I tend to be one of these cold realists. And take us back to the metaphor of Annapolis in 1786. You know, Alexander Hamilton's New York delegation abandoned him there. And New York actually lost its vote. Nonetheless, he stayed and you know, supported strongly James Madison's urging that they make the mess more than it could otherwise be, and try in the following year to expand the Federal Convention and do something. And so I found it a very heartening thing, but it was sort of born out of realism, bungling, Hamilton having the rug pulled out from underneath him, and it sounded so similar to what's happening today in the lead up to the November Annapolis summit here in 2007 that I think it's an interesting metaphor. I want to thank Daniel Levy, Gaith Alamari, and Rob Malley for their leadership in this issue, as well as Henry Siegman with the U.S. Middle East Project, who was supportive of this letter, the International Crisis Group, and the New America Foundation. I hope you'll grab a copy. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and the C-SPAN audience for joining us today, too. Thank you very much.